For thousands of years, the miracles recorded in the Bible have captivated believers and skeptics alike. These extraordinary events, from parting seas to raising the dead, have shaped the faith of billions across the globe. But in our modern age of scientific discovery, where we can explain so much about the natural world, a question persists. Can science explain these ancient wonders? Today we're diving deep into 10 of the most profound biblical miracles, examining them through the lens of both faith and science. We'll explore the theories scientists have proposed, the evidence they've uncovered, and the mysteries that remain stubbornly unexplained. Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, this exploration will challenge you to think critically about the intersection of faith and reason. Before we begin, let me be clear. This isn't about proving or disproving anyone's beliefs. The purpose here is to present the facts as we know them, share the scientific theories that have been proposed, and let you draw your own conclusions. Some of these miracles have fascinating natural explanations that make them even more remarkable. Others remain complete mysteries that defy our current understanding of physics, biology, and chemistry. Science has made incredible strides in explaining natural phenomena. We understand weather patterns, geological events, and biological processes far better than ever before. Yet, when we apply these tools to ancient accounts, we often find ourselves at a crossroads between what we can explain and what remains beyond our grasp. So, are you ready to explore the unexplainable? Let's examine 10 biblical miracles that continue to puzzle scientists, inspire believers, and spark debate in academic circles around the world. From the deserts of Egypt to the shores of Galilee, from the walls of ancient cities to the tomb of a man named Lazarus, we're about to embark on a journey through time, faith, and science. Miracle 1. The parting of the Red Sea. Perhaps no biblical miracle is more iconic than Moses stretching out his staff and watching the waters of the Red Sea part before the fleeing Israelites. The book of Exodus describes how God sent a strong east wind that blew all night, turning the sea into dry land. The Israelites crossed safely, but when the Egyptian army pursued, the waters rushed back, destroying Pharaoh's forces. Scientists have long been fascinated by this account. In recent years, researchers from the National Center for Atmospheric Research ran computer simulations suggesting that a powerful wind, blowing at 67 miles per hour for approximately 12 hours, could theoretically push back shallow water at a specific location where a river met a coastal lagoon in the Nile Delta. This phenomenon, called a wind set-down, has been observed in modern times. In 2010, Lake Erie experienced a similar event where strong winds literally pushed water away, exposing the lake bed. The Russian oceanographer Naum Volzinger proposed that an ancient reef existed close to the water's surface 3,500 years ago. His calculations showed that the right wind conditions could have exposed this reef for just enough time for people to cross before the waters returned. The timing, he argued, was the true miracle. Yet other researchers have proposed even more dramatic theories. A study published in 2024 suggested that a rare meteorological event called a metacane, similar to a hurricane but unique to the Mediterranean, could have caused a negative storm surge. Still others have pointed to Rossby waves, massive water movements caused by Earth's rotation, or even tidal resonance as possible explanations. But here's where science hits a wall. Even if we accept that natural forces could part water, the biblical account describes far more than just favorable conditions. The text states that the waters formed walls on both sides of the crossing, and that both the sun and moon were involved in the miraculous timing. No computer model has successfully replicated waters standing up as solid walls while people walked through on dry ground. The coordination of timing, the precise location, and the immediate return of the waters when needed paint a picture that transcends simple meteorology. Furthermore, geological surveys of the Red Sea and Gulf of Suez show waters far too deep for any wind phenomenon to expose the seabed. While the wind set-down theory works for shallow lagoons, it fails for the deeper waters traditionally associated with the crossing site. The archaeological evidence from the Sinai Peninsula also raises questions about the exact route the Israelites took, making it difficult to pinpoint where such an event might have occurred. Perhaps most puzzling is the repeated emphasis in the biblical text that this was no ordinary event. The passage states there had never been a day like it before or since. If this were simply a rare but natural occurrence, surely it would have happened again in the thousands of years since. Yet no historical record from that region documents anything similar. The miracle of the Red Sea parting remains one of those events where proposed scientific explanations make the story more remarkable, not less. Even if natural forces played a role, the precision timing, the perfect conditions, and the catastrophic consequences for those who followed defy statistical probability. Whether you see the hand of God directing natural forces or a supernatural suspension of physical laws, science cannot fully account for what the ancient Israelites witnessed that night. The waters parted, a nation walked through on dry land, and an army was destroyed, leaving us with a mystery that continues to challenge both believers and scientists more than 3 millennia later. Miracle 2. The Virgin Birth of Jesus. The virgin birth of Jesus Christ stands as one of Christianity's most fundamental doctrines and one of science's most challenging propositions. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke clearly state that Mary conceived Jesus without any sexual relationship, through the power of the Holy Spirit. For believers, this is a divine mystery. For scientists, it presents a biological impossibility. Biologically speaking, human reproduction requires both male and female genetic material. A human egg contains 23 chromosomes, and sperm contributes another 23, creating the 46 chromosomes necessary for human development. Without sperm, there's no Y chromosome, which determines male sex. So how could Mary, a virgin, give birth to a male child? Some scientists have explored the concept of parthenogenesis, a form of reproduction where an organism develops from an unfertilized egg. This occurs naturally in some reptiles, fish, and insects. In 2004, Japanese researchers even created a parthenogenetic mouse by altering specific genes. However, parthenogenesis in these cases produces only females, because no Y chromosome is present. Additionally, mammals have a process called genomic imprinting that specifically prevents parthenogenesis from occurring naturally. Certain genes must be activated by both parents for development to proceed, and this failsafe has never been naturally overcome in humans. Science writer Arathi Prasad, in her book Like a Virgin, proposed theoretical workarounds. Perhaps Mary was a genetic chimera, formed from both male and female embryonic tissue, giving her access to Y chromosomal material. Or perhaps she had ovotestes, a rare condition where ovarian and testicular tissue coexist, potentially allowing for self-fertilization. While there has been one documented case of a person born with characteristics that might theoretically allow self-fertilization, this individual had not reached reproductive maturity when the case was documented. Another bizarre scientific explanation comes from a 1988 medical report. A young woman born without a vaginal opening became pregnant after a traumatic incident allowed sperm to enter her reproductive system through an unusual pathway. While this demonstrates sperm's remarkable resilience, it requires the presence of sperm in the first place, which the biblical account explicitly denies. Here's the fundamental problem. Every proposed scientific mechanism requires either male genetic material from somewhere or results in a female offspring. The virgin birth needs to produce a male child without any male involvement. This violates everything we understand about mammalian reproduction. Even if we accept the most generous hypothetical scenarios, they require either undocumented genetic anomalies or circumstances not supported by the biblical narrative. Warren Booth, a leading expert in parthenogenesis from the University of Tulsa, stated plainly that he can conceive of no feasible scientific explanation for how a woman who abstained from intercourse could give birth to a child of either sex, let alone a male child. The genetic, hormonal, and developmental requirements simply don't align with any known biological process. Evangelical theologian Vern Poythress offers a different perspective. He argues that God, as the author of natural laws, is not bound by them. God could have created the necessary Y chromosome from nothing, or from the very atoms in Mary's womb, fertilizing her egg supernaturally. From this viewpoint, attempting to find a natural explanation misses the point entirely. The virgin birth was never meant to be natural. It was meant to be miraculous. The virgin birth remains exactly what it was always claimed to be: a miracle. Science can propose hypothetical mechanisms, but none of them work without violating established biological principles or requiring conditions that leave no evidence and have never been documented. Whether you believe it happened depends not on scientific evidence, but on whether you accept the possibility of divine intervention in the natural order. For scientists, it represents an impossibility. For believers, it represents the very definition of miraculous, an event that could only occur through divine power superseding natural law. Miracle 3. Jesus walking on water. The image of Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee is one of the most recognizable scenes in the New Testament. 3 Gospels record the event: Matthew, Mark, and John. The disciples were crossing the lake at night when a storm arose. Between 3 and 6 in the morning, they saw Jesus approaching, walking on the water's surface. Initially terrified, thinking he was a ghost, they were calmed by his voice. Peter even attempted to walk on water himself before losing faith and beginning to sink. From a physics perspective, walking on water seems straightforward to dismiss. Water cannot support the weight of a human body. The density of human tissue is greater than water, and without displacement or sufficient surface tension, a person will sink. This is basic Archimedes' principle, taught in elementary school science classes. Yet scientists have tried to explain it. In 2006, Florida State University oceanographer Doran Knopf published a study proposing that Jesus might have walked on a rare patch of floating ice. His research suggested that unusual cold periods between 2,500 and 1,500 years ago could have created what he called springs ice on the Sea of Galilee. This would occur when fresh water froze on the surface near salty springs, creating patches of ice difficult to distinguish from the surrounding water. The study received significant media attention. However, this explanation has serious problems. First, the Sea of Galilee rarely, if ever, freezes. Even during ancient cold periods, sustained freezing temperatures would have been extraordinary and certainly noteworthy enough for the Gospel writers to mention. Second, if Jesus were walking on ice, the disciples in the boat would have encountered the same ice. They were experienced fishermen who knew their lake intimately. Third, ice would not explain how Peter briefly walked on water before sinking, how Jesus helped him back up, or how Jesus calmed the storm immediately after entering the boat. Some have suggested unusual water surface tension, or even that Jesus utilized some unknown physical principle we haven't yet discovered. A few have proposed he walked on a sandbar or in very shallow water, creating an optical illusion. But the text explicitly states the boat was in the middle of the lake, 3 to 4 miles from shore, in deep water. the disciples wouldn't have been terrified by someone walking in shallow water. Others have theorized about non-Newtonian fluids, substances that can behave like solids under certain stress conditions. You can run across a pool filled with cornstarch and water, for instance, because rapid pressure temporarily solidifies the mixture. Could the Sea of Galilee, under specific conditions with specific mineral content, have exhibited similar properties? The answer is no. The chemical composition of the Sea of Galilee, while unique due to its connection to underground springs, has never shown non-Newtonian properties. Furthermore, this wouldn't explain how Jesus stood still on the water, or how he reached down to grab Peter. The fundamental issue is that walking on water requires either changing the properties of water itself or changing the properties of the human body. Neither has a naturalistic explanation given the constraints of the biblical account. Water would need to become solid or dramatically increase its surface tension. The human body would need to become light enough to float on surface tension alone, which would require reducing body mass to nearly nothing. What makes this miracle particularly challenging is its multiple attestations and the matter-of-fact way it's presented. The Gospel writers don't treat it as allegory or metaphor. They describe it as eyewitnesses would, with specific details about time, location, and the disciples' reactions. Jesus later walked on water again in calmer conditions, and the consistent testimony across accounts gives it historical weight that skeptics must contend with. Science cannot explain how Jesus walked on water because the laws of physics simply do not permit it. Miracle 4. The feeding of the 5,000. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle, besides the resurrection, recorded in all four Gospels. According to the accounts, Jesus took 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, offered by a young boy, and fed a massive crowd. The Gospel of Matthew specifies there were 5,000 men, besides women and children, meaning the actual crowd could have numbered 15 to 20,000 people. After everyone ate until satisfied, the disciples collected 12 baskets of leftover fragments. In 2024, scientists proposed an explanation based on recent observations of fish behavior in the Sea of Galilee. Researchers noted that the lake periodically experiences mass fish mortality events due to oxygen depletion. When this occurs, fish float to the surface, dead but fresh, making them incredibly easy to collect. The theory suggests that Jesus' miracle coincided with such an event, explaining the miraculous catch of fish mentioned in other gospel passages. This explanation immediately falls apart when we examine the biblical text. The 5 loaves and 2 fish weren't caught fresh from the lake. They were a packed lunch belonging to a boy who brought them from home. John's Gospel makes this explicit. A young boy had 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. These were prepared, portable food items, not freshly caught fish. Furthermore, the disciples specifically told Jesus that buying enough food for the crowd would require more than half a year's wages. If fish were floating everywhere, this wouldn't have been a concern. The multiplication itself defies all known physical principles. Matter cannot be created from nothing according to the law of conservation of mass. When you break a loaf of bread, you don't get more bread, you get smaller pieces of the same amount of bread. Jesus apparently created new matter, new molecules, new atoms, complete with the complex structure of grain-based bread and fish tissue, all while distributing food to thousands of people. Some skeptics have suggested that Jesus' sharing inspired others in the crowd to share their own hidden food, creating the appearance of multiplication. This psychologizing explanation fails on multiple counts. First, the text explicitly states they collected 12 baskets of leftovers from the original 5 loaves. Second, this wouldn't explain why the Gospel writers and early church considered it miraculous enough to include in all 4 Gospels. Third, ancient audiences weren't naive. They understood sharing. If that's what happened, calling it a miracle would have made them look foolish. Others propose the story is metaphorical, teaching a spiritual lesson about sharing or about Jesus as the bread of life. However, the account is presented with specific, concrete details: the number of loaves, the number of fish, the number of people, the number of baskets, even the type of bread. These aren't characteristics of allegory. They're characteristics of eyewitness testimony. The physical requirements of this miracle are staggering. Creating enough bread and fish to feed 15,000 people to satisfaction, with substantial leftovers, would require generating approximately 4,000 pounds of food. That food would need to have proper nutritional content, proper taste and texture, proper molecular structure. It would need to appear in a form that could be distributed. All of this happened instantaneously and repeatedly as Jesus kept breaking and distributing pieces. Modern food science can tell us exactly what bread and fish are made of at the molecular level. We know the proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and water content. We can explain how wheat becomes bread through chemical reactions in baking. What we cannot explain is how 5 loaves become 5,000 loaves without any source of raw materials, without any process, and without any time. The multiplication of matter itself remains scientifically impossible. This miracle doesn't just bend the rules of science, it breaks them completely, creating something from virtually nothing, and doing so with perfect repeatability throughout the distribution process. Miracle 5. Jonah and the Great Fish. The story of Jonah has become almost synonymous with biblical miracles that skeptics find impossible to believe. The prophet, fleeing from God's command, is thrown overboard during a storm and swallowed by a great fish. He survives in the creature's belly for 3 days and 3 nights before being vomited onto shore, where he completes his mission to Nineveh. Marine biologists have examined whether any sea creature could actually swallow a human whole. The sperm whale, which can grow over 60 feet long, has a throat large enough to potentially admit a human. The whale shark, the largest fish in the ocean, has a mouth 4 feet wide. Theoretically, a human could fit into either creature's mouth. However, surviving inside is another matter entirely. A whale's or large fish's throat leads to a stomach filled with powerful digestive acids designed to break down food. The pH level in a sperm whale's stomach can be as low as 2.5, similar to battery acid. Human skin would begin breaking down within hours. Furthermore, there's essentially no oxygen inside a whale's stomach. A human might survive a few minutes at most before suffocating, not 3 days. Some have suggested Jonah might have been lodged in the creature's throat or mouth rather than its stomach, where he could potentially breathe. However, whale throats are not chambers with air. They're muscular tubes that contract during swallowing. A sperm whale's throat, despite the whale's massive size, is surprisingly narrow, estimated at only about 10 to 12 inches in diameter. Even if a human passed through initially, they would be crushed by the throat's muscular contractions. The biblical text itself provides details that make survival even more improbable. Jonah prays from inside the fish, describing seaweed wrapped around his head and referring to being in the depths of the earth. He speaks of being at the roots of the mountains, with the earth's bars closing behind him. His prayer suggests he experienced death or near death, with some theologians arguing Jonah actually died and was resurrected. The most honest scientific assessment is that survival inside any sea creature for 3 days is biologically impossible without divine intervention. The lack of oxygen, the presence of digestive fluids, the pressure and the toxic environment make it unsurvivable. Even if we accept the most generous interpretation, with Jonah somehow protected in a pocket of air, the absence of fresh water, food, and the psychological trauma would be overwhelming. What makes the Jonah account particularly interesting is Jesus' own reference to it. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus explicitly compares Jonah's 3 days in the fish to his own 3 days in the tomb. Jesus treats the event as historical fact, not allegory. He uses it as a prophetic type, a preview of his death and resurrection. If Jonah's experience was merely metaphorical, Jesus' comparison loses its power and meaning. The biblical text itself acknowledges the miraculous nature of the event by stating that God prepared the fish specifically for this purpose. The Hebrew word used emphasizes that this wasn't a chance encounter with an ordinary sea creature. God appointed a specific fish for a specific purpose. This suggests the creature itself may have been uniquely created or modified for Jonah's preservation. Some scholars note the religious significance of fish imagery in ancient Near Eastern cultures. The Philistines and Assyrians worshipped Dagon, a fish god. Jonah being vomited from a great fish at Nineveh might have appeared to them as their deity delivering a prophet, giving Jonah immediate credibility. Whether this cultural context was part of God's design, we can only speculate. Science cannot explain Jonah's survival because survival in such conditions is impossible by every measure of biology and physiology we possess. This miracle requires either complete suspension of natural law or supernatural preservation of life in an environment that should guarantee death within minutes. The story stands as one of the Bible's clearest examples of divine intervention overriding biological reality. Miracle 6: Noah's Flood. The account of Noah's flood presents one of the Bible's most sweeping miracles. A global deluge covering the entire earth, including the highest mountains, destroying all land life except what was preserved on the ark. For centuries, both believers and skeptics have debated whether such an event could have occurred and what evidence might support it. Geologists have extensively studied the possibility of a worldwide flood. The geological record presents significant challenges to a global inundation occurring within the time frame described in Genesis. Rock layers across continents show clear patterns of formation over millions of years, not the catastrophic rapid deposition we would expect from a single worldwide flood. Fossil records show different organisms existing at different times, not all dying simultaneously in one event. The amount of water required poses another problem. To cover Mount Everest, which stands at 29,000 feet, would require roughly 1 billion cubic kilometers of water. Currently, Earth's oceans contain about 1.3 billion cubic kilometers. The Genesis account mentions both underground water and water from above. But even if we account for all known water on Earth, including ice caps and groundwater, there's insufficient water to cover all mountains. Where would this water come from, and where did it go afterward? However, geological evidence does support massive regional flooding events in the ancient Near East. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis suggests that around 7,000 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters catastrophically breached into the Black Sea basin, flooding vast inhabited areas. This event would have seemed world-ending to those experiencing it. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia shows layers of flood deposits in multiple ancient cities, suggesting periodic catastrophic flooding of the region. Some researchers argue for a more localized understanding of the biblical account. The Hebrew words translated as earth and world can also mean land or region. From Noah's perspective, if water covered all the land he could see in every direction, his whole world was indeed flooded. Ancient Near Eastern literature often used universal language for regional events. The mountains of Ararat mentioned in Genesis likely refers to the general region of Urartu, not specifically the peak we call Mount Ararat today. Recent studies of the Durupinar Formation in Turkey, a boat-shaped geological feature near Mount Ararat, have generated renewed interest. Researchers found marine deposits and evidence that the area was once underwater. While some believe this might be the remains of the Ark, Most geologists attribute the formation to natural processes. The marine deposits prove the region was underwater at some point, but not necessarily during a global flood. Perhaps most challenging for a literal global flood is the distribution of animal species. If all land animals descended from pairs on the Ark just a few thousand years ago, we would expect genetic evidence of severe bottlenecks in all species occurring at the same time. Instead, different species show bottlenecks at different times, if at all. The diversity we see today, particularly on isolated islands and continents, would require impossibly rapid speciation following the flood. Yet the flood narrative appears across numerous ancient cultures worldwide. Babylonian, Sumerian, Greek, and Native American traditions all contain flood stories. While skeptics argue these represent independent local flood experiences, believers see them as distant memories of a real global event. The sedimentary rock formations covering continents, containing marine fossils high in mountain ranges, demonstrate that most land was indeed underwater at various points in Earth's history. However, geology dates these submersions to hundreds of millions of years ago, not thousands. Young Earth creationists argue that radiometric dating is flawed and that these formations actually date to Noah's flood. But this remains a minority view in the scientific community. Whether Noah's flood was global or regional, whether it occurred thousands or millions of years ago, it remains a pivotal event in biblical history that defies complete scientific explanation within the traditional time frame and scale described in Genesis. Miracle 7. The Burning Bush. Moses' encounter with the burning bush stands as one of the most theologically significant events in the Hebrew Bible. While tending his father-in-law's flock near Mount Horeb, Moses saw a bush that burned with fire, yet was not consumed. From within this bush, God spoke to him, commanding him to lead the Israelites out of Egyptian slavery. The sight was so unusual that Moses turned aside to investigate, prompting God to tell him to remove his sandals because he stood on holy ground. Scientists have proposed several natural explanations for this phenomenon. One theory points to the Dictamnus albus plant, also called the gas plant, which grows throughout North Africa. During hot weather, this plant exudes volatile oils containing terpenes, flavonoids, and other flammable compounds. Under the right conditions, these vapors can ignite, creating a brief flash of fire around the plant. However, this explanation has critical flaws. First, these oils don't spontaneously combust. They require an ignition source. Moses wouldn't have been carrying anything to start such a fire. Second, when the vapors do ignite, the fire lasts only seconds, not long enough for Moses to observe it from a distance, approach it, and have an extended conversation. Third, if the leaves themselves caught fire, the bush would indeed be consumed, contradicting the biblical account's most essential detail. Another hypothesis suggests underground volcanic activity or natural gas vents. In some locations, like the volcanic island of Lanzarote, geothermal heat can cause vegetation to catch fire and continue burning as long as heat vents remain active. Colin Humphrey, in his book The Miracles of Exodus, proposed that a natural gas vent beneath the bush could have sustained the fire without consuming the bush itself. While this is more plausible than the gas plant theory, it still faces problems. Natural gas burns with a characteristic blue flame and produces heat that would quickly damage and consume organic material in close proximity. The biblical account describes Moses approaching close enough to hear God speak clearly, which would be impossible if standing near an intensely hot gas vent. Additionally, such geological features are rare in the Sinai Peninsula, and no known gas vents exist near traditional sites associated with Mount Horeb. Professor Benny Shannon from Hebrew University offered a more controversial explanation: hallucination. He proposed that Moses consumed plants containing DMT, similar to ayahuasca, leading to a powerful hallucinogenic experience. Shannon based this on the presence of acacia trees in the Sinai, which contain psychoactive compounds, and on his own experiences with such substances. However, this theory reduces one of the Bible's most important theophanies to a drug trip, requiring that we dismiss the account's historical and theological significance. The biblical text itself emphasizes that this was no ordinary fire. The phrase used indicates the fire was in the bush, but not of the bush, meaning it had an independent source of energy. The fire didn't use the bush as fuel, which is why the bush wasn't consumed. This description sounds less like any natural combustion process and more like a completely different phenomenon. Theologically, the burning bush represents God's nature, holy, consuming, yet not destructive to what he chooses to preserve. The bush represents Israel itself, afflicted and oppressed in Egypt, yet not destroyed. The fire represents God's presence, his holiness that both purifies and preserves. This symbolism would be lost if the bush were simply a plant with flammable oils or a geological curiosity. What Moses witnessed was identified in theological terms as a theophany, a visible manifestation of God's presence. The Bible records several instances where God's presence appears as fire: the pillar of fire in the wilderness, the fire on Mount Sinai, the consuming fire in Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal. In each case, the fire behaves in ways that violate normal combustion principles. Science can explain fire, but it cannot explain fire that burns without fuel, without heat damage, and without consuming its apparent source. Miracle 8. The Walls of Jericho. The conquest of Jericho presents one of the Old Testament's most dramatic military victories achieved through miraculous means. According to the book of Joshua, God commanded the Israelites to march around the city once daily for 6 days, with priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant and blowing ram's horns. On the 7th day, they marched around 7 times. The priests blew their horns, the people shouted, and the walls collapsed, allowing the Israelites to take the city. Archaeological excavations at Tel es-Sultan, the site of ancient Jericho, have revealed that the city did indeed have substantial fortification walls that collapsed at various points in its history. British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon conducted extensive digs in the 1950s, finding evidence of walls that had fallen outward, creating ramps of rubble that attackers could have climbed. This matches the biblical account, which describes the Israelites going straight into the city after the walls fell. The most likely natural explanation proposed by scientists is an earthquake. Jericho sits just 4 miles from the Jericho Fault Line, part of the Jordan Rift Valley system, one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. The area has experienced major earthquakes in recorded history, including a 6.25 magnitude quake in 1927. An earthquake could theoretically cause walls to collapse, especially mud brick walls common in that era and region. Recent studies have explored whether resonance could have played a role. Resonance occurs when an external force matches an object's natural frequency, causing dramatic vibrations. Every structure has a natural frequency at which it prefers to vibrate. If the marching footsteps of thousands of people, combined with the sound waves from the trumpets and shouting, somehow matched the wall's resonant frequency, it could have weakened the structure enough to cause collapse. Calculations suggest that human shouting produces frequencies around 300 Hz, and trumpet blasts can range from 200 to 600 Hz. If the walls had a natural frequency within this range, and if the sound was sustained and coordinated, resonance could theoretically contribute to structural failure. Modern examples include suspension bridges swaying dramatically when wind or marching soldiers create resonant conditions. However, several factors make this explanation insufficient. First, for resonance to work effectively, the frequency must be precisely maintained and sustained. The biblical account describes one long trumpet blast and a single shout, not sustained tones. Second, the walls would need to be particularly vulnerable to these specific frequencies. Third, mud brick walls, especially thick fortification walls, typically have natural frequencies much lower than what human voices and primitive trumpets can produce. Moreover, the archaeological evidence shows selectivity in the destruction. Rahab's house, built into the wall on the north side, remained standing while the rest of the walls fell. An earthquake or resonance effect would not discriminate between one section and another in this manner. The biblical account explicitly states that Rahab and her family were spared because she had helped the Israelite spies, and her house survived intact. This suggests the collapse was not entirely due to natural forces affecting the structure uniformly. The timing presents another challenge. The walls fell at exactly the moment the Israelites shouted, after exactly 7 days of marching, on the 7th circuit of the 7th day. If this were an earthquake, its timing was impossibly precise. Earthquake prediction remains difficult today with modern technology. The idea that Joshua could have predicted one to the exact moment strains credulity. The combination of factors, the precise timing, the selective destruction, and the complete collapse of fortifications that should have required sustained siege warfare or powerful battering rams suggests something beyond normal structural failure. While natural forces may have been involved, the coordination and specificity of the event indicate supernatural direction at minimum. The walls of Jericho didn't just fall. They fell at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way, creating exactly the right conditions for the Israelites to take the city. Miracle 9, the sun standing still. Joshua chapter 10 records one of the Bible's most astronomically challenging miracles. During a battle with the Amorite coalition at Gibeon, Joshua prayed for the sun and moon to stand still, so the Israelites would have enough daylight to complete their victory. The text states that the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down for about a full day. The passage concludes by noting there has never been a day like it before or since. From an astronomical perspective, for the sun to appear to stand still, the Earth's rotation would need to stop or dramatically slow. Earth rotates at about 1,000 miles per hour at the equator. Suddenly, stopping this rotation would have catastrophic consequences. The atmosphere and oceans, possessing tremendous momentum, would continue moving, generating 1,000-mile-per-hour winds and massive tsunami waves that would scour the continents. Nothing on Earth's surface would survive. Some propose God could have slowed rotation gradually enough to prevent these disasters, but this requires imagining an enormous number of supporting miracles to manage momentum, inertia, gravitational effects, and tidal forces. The moon's orbit would be affected. The Earth's relationship with the sun would change. The complex gravitational dance of the solar system would need constant supernatural adjustment. In 2021, researchers proposed an alternative interpretation. The event was actually a solar eclipse. By reanalyzing the original Hebrew text, they noted that the word translated stand still, dam, shares roots with a Babylonian term used to describe eclipses. Perhaps Joshua wasn't asking for the sun to stop moving, but to stop shining. A solar eclipse would darken the sky, cooling the battlefield and potentially benefiting the Israelites. Cambridge researchers, using astronomical calculations, pinpointed a possible eclipse to October 30th, 1207 BCE. This interpretation is intriguing, but it faces problems. First, solar eclipses last minutes, not hours, and certainly not a full day. Second, the text explicitly states the sun stopped in the middle of the sky, suggesting high noon, not the gradual dimming of an eclipse. Third, Joshua's prayer specifically asks for extended daylight to finish the battle, not darkness. Another proposal suggests the event describes unusual atmospheric conditions that created a mirage or optical illusion, making it appear that more time had passed than actually did. Or perhaps God refracted the sun's light around the earth, keeping the battlefield illuminated after the sun had geometrically set. While creative, these explanations strain to account for the text's plain meaning and the repeated emphasis that this was an unprecedented event. The text also mentions that the moon stopped in the valley of Ajalon. Any natural explanation must account for both celestial bodies appearing to halt. An eclipse doesn't cause the moon to stop. Atmospheric phenomena wouldn't affect the moon's apparent position. Only the cessation of Earth's rotation would cause both the sun and moon to appear stationary. Some point out that we still use phrases like sunrise and sunset, even though we know the sun doesn't actually move around the Earth. Perhaps the biblical account uses similar phenomenological language, describing appearance rather than reality. However, the passage emphasizes the uniqueness and miraculous nature of the event, suggesting more than just typical observational language. The biblical text references the Book of Jashar, an apparently ancient source that no longer exists, suggesting this event was considered significant enough to be recorded in multiple sources. If this were merely unusual weather or a misdescribed eclipse, why would it merit such attention? What we're left with is an account that describes either a complete suspension of Earth's rotation with countless supporting miracles to prevent global catastrophe, or a supernatural manipulation of light itself to create extended daylight without the physical movement of celestial bodies. Neither explanation fits within our understanding of physics. The sun standing still remains one of those miracles where every proposed natural explanation either fails to match the biblical description or requires supernatural intervention anyway. Miracle 10. The Resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus Christ stands as Christianity's central miracle and most audacious claim. The Gospels record that Jesus, having been crucified and confirmed dead, was placed in a tomb that was sealed and guarded. 3 days later, the tomb was found empty, and Jesus appeared to his disciples and over 500 other witnesses over a 40-day period. The transformed nature of his body, the number and diversity of witnesses, and the radical change in the disciples' behavior form the foundation of Christian faith. From a biological standpoint, death is irreversible. When the heart stops, oxygen ceases flowing to the brain, and brain cells begin dying within minutes. After hours, rigor mortis sets in. Within days, decomposition begins. The Roman executioners who confirmed Jesus' death were professional killers who understood their work. The spear thrust into Jesus' side, producing blood and water, indicated that death had occurred. Medical experts analyzing the crucifixion account agree. Jesus was genuinely dead by any physiological measure. The historical evidence surrounding the resurrection focuses on several key facts that even skeptical scholars acknowledge. First, Jesus was crucified and died. This is as historically certain as any ancient event can be. Second, Jesus was buried in a tomb. Third, the tomb was found empty. Fourth, numerous people claim to have seen the risen Jesus. Fifth, the disciples were transformed from terrified deserters into bold proclaimers of the resurrection, most dying as martyrs for this claim. Skeptics have proposed natural explanations. The swoon theory suggests Jesus didn't actually die, but merely lost consciousness, reviving in the cool tomb. However, this fails to account for the severity of Roman crucifixion, the confirmation of death by soldiers, the massive stone sealing the tomb, and the fact that a barely alive, severely wounded man could not have removed grave clothes, moved a massive stone, overcome guards, and convinced disciples he had conquered death. The stolen body theory claims the disciples took Jesus' body and invented the resurrection story. This explanation fails on multiple counts. The disciples had no motive. They gained nothing but persecution, poverty, and martyrdom. People don't die for what they know is a lie. The Roman guard at the tomb would have prevented theft. The grave clothes were found neatly arranged, not hastily torn off. Most importantly, this doesn't explain the reported post-resurrection appearances to hundreds of people. Others propose hallucination or mass delusion. However, hallucinations are individual experiences, not group events. 500 people don't hallucinate the same thing simultaneously. The disciples didn't expect resurrection. They were hiding in fear. People don't hallucinate eating fish with someone or touching their wounds. The variety of witnesses, times, and locations makes hallucinations scientifically implausible. The transformation of the disciples provides compelling evidence. Peter, who denied knowing Jesus 3 times to save his own life, later boldly preached Jesus' resurrection in Jerusalem despite threats, and tradition holds he was eventually crucified for his faith. James, Jesus' skeptical brother, became a believer and leader in the early church after seeing the risen Christ. Saul, a persecutor of Christians, became Paul the Apostle after encountering the risen Jesus. People don't undergo such radical transformations based on lies or delusions. The empty tomb remains unexplained by natural means. If Jesus didn't rise, someone had to remove the body. Yet no one had the means, motive, or opportunity. The Roman and Jewish authorities wanted to crush this movement. Producing Jesus' body would have accomplished that instantly. The disciples had neither the courage nor the skill to overcome Roman guards. Grave robbery doesn't explain the ordered grave clothes or the numerous appearances. Modern science can explain resuscitation of the recently deceased through CPR and defibrillation. We can revive people whose hearts have stopped. But we cannot revive people who have been dead for 3 days, whose bodies have begun decomposing. We cannot explain how a corpse returns to life, walks, talks, eats, and then dematerializes through walls. The resurrection doesn't just violate biological principles. It reverses death itself, something that remains impossible by any scientific measure. Conclusion. We've journeyed through 10 of the Bible's most remarkable miracles, examining them through both the lens of faith and the microscope of science. What have we discovered? That while science can propose theories, suggest natural mechanisms, and explain similar phenomena, it ultimately cannot fully account for these events as described in the biblical text. Some miracles have fascinating potential natural explanations that make them no less remarkable. Wind patterns that could part water, astronomical events that could stop the sun's appearance, geological forces that could topple walls, all remind us that God often works through natural means elevated to extraordinary timing and effect. Yet in each case, the precision, the scale, and the specific circumstances described push beyond what nature alone can accomplish. Other miracles remain completely inexplicable by current scientific understanding. Walking on water, virgin birth, resurrection from death. These events require suspension or transcendence of physical and biological laws that govern our universe. Science can tell us these things are impossible. It cannot tell us they didn't happen. The debate between faith and science over these miracles often misses a crucial point. Miracles, by definition, are not natural events. They are supernatural interventions in the natural order. Expecting science to explain miracles is like asking a fish to describe flight. Science studies repeatable natural phenomena. Miracles are unique, unrepeatable divine actions. The tools of science simply cannot measure the supernatural. Whether you believe these miracles occurred as described depends on your worldview. If you accept only what current science can explain, you must reject them. If you acknowledge the possibility of a transcendent God who created natural laws and can work beyond them, these miracles become possible, even probable given the theological context. What remains undeniable is that these events, whether miraculous or mythical, have shaped human history, inspired billions, and continue to challenge our understanding of what is possible. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. I encourage you to continue investigating, questioning, and seeking truth, wherever that journey leads you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.